Continuing Demetrius from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Hitherto there had never been seen a galley with 15 or 16 ranges of oars. At a latter time, Ptolemy Philopator built one of 40 rows, which was 280 cubits in length, a cubit being, fingertip to elbow, or something equivalent on someone, right? And the height of her to the top of her stern, 48 cubits. She had 400 sailors and 4,000 rowers, and afforded room besides for very near 3,000 soldiers to fight on her decks. But this, after all, was for show, and not for service, scarcely differing from a fixed edifice ashore, and was not to be moved without extreme toil and peril. Whereas these galleys of Demetrius were meant quite as much for fighting as for looking at, were not the less serviceable for their magnificence, and were as wonderful for their speed and general performance as for their size. These mighty preparations against Asia, the like of which had not been made since Alexander first invaded it, united Seleucus, Ptolemy, and Lysimachus in a confederacy for their defense. They also dispatched ambassadors to Plutarch to persuade him to make a diversion by attacking Macedonia. He did not think there was any validity in a treaty which Demetrius had concluded, not as an engagement to be at peace with him, but as a means of enabling himself to make war first upon the enemy of his choice. So when Plutarch accepted their proposals, Demetrius, still in the midst of his preparations, was encompassed with war on all sides. Ptolemy, with a mighty navy, invaded Greece. Lysimachus entered Macedonia upon the side of Thraca, and Plutarch from the Epirot border, both of them spoiling and wasting the country. Demetrius, having his son to look after Greece, marched to the relief of Macedon, and first of all to oppose Lysimachus. On his way, he received the news that Plutarch had taken the city Beroea, and the report quickly getting out among the soldiers, all discipline at once was lost, and the camp was filled with lamentations and tears, anger and execrations on Demetrius. They would stay no longer. They would march off, as they said, to take care of their country, friends, and families. But in reality, the intention was to revolt to Lysimachus. Demetrius, therefore, thought it his business to keep them as far away as he could from Lysimachus, who was their own countryman, and as for Alexander's sake, kindly looked upon by many, they would be ready to fight with Plutarch, a newcomer and a foreigner, whom they could hardly prefer to himself. But he found himself under a great mistake in these conjectures, for when he had advanced and pitched his camp near, the old admiration for Plutarch's gallantry and arms revived again, and as they had been used from time immemorial to suppose that the best king was he that was the bravest soldier, so now they were also told of his generous usage of his prisoners, and, in short, they were eager to have any one in the place of Demetrius, and well pleased that the man should be Plutarch. At first, some straggling parties only deserted, but In a little time the whole army broke out into a universal mutiny, insomuch that at last some of them went up and told him openly that if he consulted his own safety, he were best to make haste to be gone, for that the Macedonians were resolved no longer to hazard their lives for the satisfaction of his luxury and pleasure, and this was thought fair and moderate language compared with the fierceness of the rest. So withdrawing into his tent, and, like an actor rather than a real king, laying aside his stage robes of royalty, he put on some common clothes and stole away. He was no sooner gone, but the mutinous army were fighting and quarreling for the plunder of his tent. But Parhas, coming immediately, took possession of the camp without a blow, after which he, with Lysimachus, parted the realm of Macedon betwixt them, after Demetrius had securely held it just 7 years. As for Demetrius, being thus suddenly despoiled of everything, he retired to Cassandra. His wife, Phaedra, in the passion of her grief, could not endure to see her hapless husband reduced to the condition of a private and banished man. She refused to entertain any further hope, and resolving to quit a fortune which was never permanent except for calamity, took poison and died. Demetrius, determining still to hold on by the wreck, went off to Greece and collected his friends and officers there. Menelaus, in the play of Sophocles, to give an image of his vicissitudes of a state, says, "For me my destiny, alas, is found, whirling upon the god's swift wheel around, and changing still, and as the moon's fair frame cannot continue for 2 nights the same, but out of shadow first a crescent shows, thence into beauty and perfection grows, and when the form of plenitude it wears, dwindles again, and wholly disappears." Now, if we talk about the wheel card, we have the positive for increasing, the decreasing or the negative, and the staying the same or the neutral. We have the mercury, salt, and sulfur, which is a little bit different than that, right? But we have our actions and our consciousness. And despite the circumstances, as long as we're being aright, equiposed, as you could say, and, and often you see on tarot cards represented of the various things that people worship. Of course, it's all beyond something you can represent, but the simile is yet truer of Demetrius, and the phases of his fortunes, now on the increase, presently on the wane, now filling up and now falling away, and so, at this time of apparent entire obscuration and extinction, his light again shone out, and accessions of strength little by little come in to fulfill once more the measure of his hope. At first he showed himself in the garb of a private man, and went about the cities without any of the badges of a king. One who saw him at Thebes applied to him, not inaptly, the lines of Euripides, humbled to man, laid by the Godhead's pride. He comes to Dirce, and by Ismenus' side. And one thing about the mention of Godhead, well, you have to be a polytheist to believe in Godhead, because either you believe they're lesser saints, whether you call them lesser deities, whether you call them saints or whatever, or you treat something like that. You treat the saints and angels and maybe some rock over here or whatever as like a lesser god. Now, a ritual that includes a rock or a sacred place that includes a rock or something, that's not the same as you worship the rock as like some dynamism sort of power, you know, because then the things are means of divinity. You worship divinity, and it's different. And obviously, one entity over other entities, they're also supposed to be divine. It is a bit prideful, just like humans. It's just because they're in a higher position doesn't mean, well, these other things are human too, right? But ere long his expectations had re-entered the royal track. He began once more to have about him the body and form of empire. The Thebans received back as his gift their ancient constitution. The Athenians had deserted him. It displaced Diphilus, who was that year the priest of the two tutelar deities, and restored the archons, as of old, to mark the rear. And on hearing that Demetrius was not so weak as they had expected, they sent into Macedonia to beg the protection of Parhas. Demetrius, in anger, marched to Athens and laid close siege to the city. In this distress, they sent out to him Crates, the philosopher, a person of authority and reputation, who succeeded so far that what with his entreaties and the solid reasons which he offered, Demetrius was persuaded to raise the siege, and collecting all his ships, he embarked a force of 11,000 men with cavalry, and sailed away to Asia and Caria. Well, they mean Asia instead of Asia, right? Because they're not talking about the continent, they're talking just, the one side, which in some definitions would not mean Asia, it would mean Europe or Africa or something, depending on which part you're talking about. And Lydia, to take these provinces from Lysimachus. Arriving at Miletus, he was met there by Eurydice, the sister of Phila, who brought along with her Ptolemais, one of her daughters by King Ptolemy, who had before been affianced to Demetrius, and with whom he now consummated his marriage. Immediately after, he proceeded to carry out his project, and was so fortunate in the beginning that many cities revolted to him. Others, as particularly Sardis, he took by force, and some generals of Lysimachus also came over to him with troops and money. But when Agathocles, the son of Lysimachus, arrived with an army, he retreated into Phrygia with an intention to pass into Armenia, believing that if he could once plant his foot in Armenia, he might set Media in revolt, and gain a position in Upper Asia, where a fugitive commander might find 100 ways of evasion and escape. Agathocles pressed hard upon him, and many skirmishes and conflicts occurred in which Demetrius had still the advantage, but Agathocles straitened him much in his forage, and his men showed a great dislike to his purpose, which they suspected of carrying them far away into Armenia and Media. Famine also pressed upon them, and some mistake occurred in their passage of the river Lucus, and in consequence of which a large number were swept away and drowned. Still, however, they could pass their jests. One of them fixed upon Demetrius's tent door a paper with the first verse slightly altered of Oedipus, child of the blind old man Antigonus, in what country are you bringing us? in a way, because we had the Wheel of Fortune and the Tower, and in a way, this is kind of like the Hermit, right? Because the guy is the insider, and they don't know. But at last, pestilence, as is usual, when armies are driven to such necessities as to subsist upon any food they can get, began to assail them, as well as famine, so that, having lost 8,000 of his men, with the rest he retreated and came to Tarsus. And because that city was within the dominions of Seleucus, he was anxious to prevent any plundering, and wished to give no sort of offence to Seleucus. But when he perceived it was impossible to restrain the soldiers in their extreme necessity, Agathocles also having blocked up all the avenues of Mount Taurus, he wrote a letter to Seleucus, bewailing first all his own sad fortunes, and proceeding with entreaties and supplications for some compassion on his part towards one merely connected with him, who was fallen into such calamities as might extort tenderness and pity from his very enemies. These letters so far moved Seleucus that he gave orders to the governors of those provinces that they should furnish Demetrius with all the things suitable to his royal rank, and with sufficient provisions for his troops. But Patroclus, a person whose judgment was greatly valued, and who was a friend highly trusted by Seleucus, pointed out to him that the expense of maintaining such a body of soldiers was the least important consideration, but that it was contrary to all policy to let Demetrius stay in the country, since he, of all the kings of his time, was the most violent and most addicted to daring enterprises, and he was now in a condition which might tempt persons of the greatest temper and moderation to unlawful and desperate attempts. Seleucus, excited by this advice, moved with a powerful army towards Cilicia, and Demetrius, astonished at this sudden alteration, betook himself for safety to the most inaccessible places of Mount Taurus, from whence he sent envoys to Seleucus to request from him that he would permit him the liberty to settle with his army somewhere among the independent barbarian tribes, where he might be able to make himself a petty king and end his life without further travel and hardship, or, if he refused him this, at any rate to give his troops food during the winter, and not expose him in this distressed and naked condition to the fury of his enemies. But Seleucus, whose jealousy made him put an ill construction on all he said, sent him answer that he would permit him to stay 2 months and no longer in Catania, provided he presently sent him the principal of his friends as hostage for his departure then. And in the meantime, he fortified all the passages into Syria, so that Demetrius, who saw himself thus like a wild beast in the way he encompassed on all sides in the toils, was driven in desperation to his defense, overran the country, and in several engagements in which Seleucus attacked him, had the advantage of him, particularly when he was once assailed by the Scythe chariots. He successfully avoided a charge and routed his assailants, and then, expelling the troops that were in guard of the passes, made himself master of the roads leading into Syria. And now, elated himself, and finding his soldiers also animated by these successes, he was resolved to push at all, and to have one deciding blow for the empire with Seleucus, who indeed was in considerable anxiety and distress, being averse to any assistance from Lysimachus, whom he both mistrusted and feared. and shrinking from a battle with Demetrius, whose desperation he knew, and whose fortune he had so often seen suddenly pass from the lowest to the highest, but Demetrius, in the meanwhile, was taken with a violent sickness, from which he suffered extremely himself, and which ruined all his prospects. His men deserted to the enemy, or dispersed. At last, after 40 days, he began to be so far recovered as to be able to rally his remaining forces, and marched as if he directly designed for Cilicia. But in the night, raising his camp, without sound or trumpet, he took a countermarch, and, passing the mountain Amanus, he ravaged all the lower country, as far as Corhestica. Upon this, Seleucus advancing towards him, and encamping at no great distance, Demetrius set his troops in motion to surprise him by night, and almost to the last moment Seleucus knew nothing, and was lying asleep. Some deserter came with the tidings just so soon that he had time to leap in great consternation out of bed and give the alarm to his men. And as he was putting on his boots to mount his horse, he bade the officers about him look well to it, for they had to meet a furious and terrible wild beast. But Demetrius, by the noise he heard in the camp, finding they had taken the alarm, drew off his troops in haste. With the morning's return, he found Seleucus pressing hard upon him, so sending one of his officers against the other wing, he defeated those that were opposed to himself. But Seleucus, lighting from his horse, pulling off his helmet, and taking a target, advanced to the foremost ranks of the mercenary soldiers, and, showing them who he was, bade them come over and join him, telling them that it was for their sakes only that he had so long forborne coming to extremities. And thereupon, without a blow more, they saluted Seleucus as their king, and passed over. Demetrius, who felt that this was his last change of fortune, and that he had no mere vicissitudes to expect, fled to the passes of Amanus, where, with a very few friends and followers, he threw himself into a dense forest, and there waited for the night, proposing if possible to make his escape towards Caunus, where he hoped to find his shipping ready to transport him. But upon inquiry, finding that they had not provisions even for that one day, he began to think of some other project. Whilst he was yet in doubt, his friend Sosigenus arrived, who had 400 pieces of gold about him, and with this relief he again entertained hopes of being able to reach the coast, and as soon as it began to be dark, set forward toward the passes. But perceiving by the fires that the enemies had occupied them, he gave up all thought of that road, and retreated to his old station in the wood, but not with all his men, for some had deserted, nor were those that remained as willing as they had been. One of them, in fine, ventured to speak out, and say that Demetrius had better give himself up to Seleucus, which Demetrius, overhearing, drew out his sword and would have passed it through his body, but that some of his friends interposed and prevented the attempt, persuading him to do as had been said. So at last he gave way, and sent to Seleucus to surrender himself at discretion. Seleucus, when he was told of it, said it was not Demetrius's good fortune that he had found out this means for his safety, but his own, which had added to his other honors the opportunity of showing his clemency and generosity. And forthwith he gave order to his domestic officers to prepare a royal pavilion, and all things suitable to give him splendid reception and entertainment. See, it was good he didn't commit suicide, even in the most worldly terms, right? There was in the attendance of Seleucus one Apollonidas, who, formerly had been intimate with Demetrius. He was, therefore, as the fittest person dispatched from the king to meet Demetrius, that he might feel himself more at his ease, and might come with confidence of being received as a friend and relative. No sooner was this message known, but the courtiers and officers, some few at first, and afterwards almost the whole of them, thinking Demetrius would presently become of great power with the king, hurried off, vying who should be foremost to pay him their respects, the effect of which was that compassion was converted into jealousy, and ill-natured, malicious people could the more easily insinuate to Seleucus that he was giving way to an unwisely humanity, the very sight of Demetrius having been the occasion of a dangerous excitement in the army. So, whilst Apollonidas, in great delight, and after him many others, were relating to Demetrius the kind expressions of Seleucus, and he, after so many troubles and calamities, if indeed had still any sense of his surrender of himself being a disgrace, had now in confidence on the good hopes held out to him, entirely forgotten all such thoughts. Pausanias, with a guard of 1,000 horse and foot, came to surround him, and dispersing the rest that were with him, carried him not to the presence of Seleucus, but to the Sarian Chersonesus, where he was committed to the safe custody of a strong guard. Sufficient attendance and liberal provisions were here allowed him, space for riding and walking, a park with game for hunting. Those of his friends and companions in exile who wished it had permission to see him, and messages of kindness also from time to time were brought him from Seleucus, bidding him fear nothing, and intimating that as soon as Antiochus and Stratenica should arrive, he would receive his liberty. Demetrius, however, finding himself in this condition, sent letters to those who were with his son, and to his captains and friends at Athens and Corinth, that they should give no manner of credit to any letters written to them in his name, though they were sealed with his own signet, but that, looking upon him as if he were already dead, they should maintain the cities and whatever was left of his power for Antigonus as his successor. Antigonus received the news of his father's captivity with great sorrow. He put himself into mourning, and wrote letters to the rest of the kings, and to Seleucus himself, making entreaties and offering not only to surrender what they had left, but himself to be a hostage for his father. Many cities also and princes joined in interceding for him. Only Lysimachus sent and offered a large sum of money to Seleucus to take away his life, but he, who had always shown his aversion to Lysimachus before, thought him only the greater barbarian and monster for it, nevertheless still protracted the time, reserving the favor, as he professed, for the intercession of Antiochus and Stratenica. Demetrius, who had sustained the first stroke of his misfortune, in time grew so familiar with it that by continuance it became easy. At first he persevered, one way or other, in taking exercise, in hunting so far as he had means, and in writing little by little. However, after a while he let himself grow indolent and indisposed for them, and took to dice and drinking, in which he passed most of his time, whether it were to escape the thoughts of his present conditions, with which he was haunted when sober, and to drown reflection in drunkenness. As much as that can cause forgetfulness, it can certainly poison what's left, right? Same thing with some of these psychiatric medications. Instead of finding chemical balance and stuff, people turn to those things. Or that he acknowledged to himself that this was the real happy life he had long desired and wished for, and had foolishly let himself be seduced away from it by a senseless and vain ambition, which had only brought trouble to himself and others, that the highest good which he had thought to obtain by arms and fleets and soldiers, he had now discovered unexpectedly in idleness, leisure, and repose, as indeed what other end or period is there of all the wars and dangers which hapless princes run into, whose misery and folly it is, not merely that they make luxury and pleasure instead of virtue and excellence, well, you can combine the two, the object of their lives, but that they do not so much as know where this luxury and pleasure are to be found. Having thus continued 3 years a prisoner in Chersonesus for want of exercise, and by indulging himself in eating and drinking, he fell into a disease of which he died at the age of 54. Seleucus was ill spoken of, and was himself greatly grieved that he had yielded so far to his suspicions, and had let himself so much be outdone by the barbarian Tramicatus of Rak, who had shown so much humanity and such a kingly temper in his treatment of his prisoner Lysimachus. There was something dramatic and theatrical in the very funeral ceremonies with which Demetrius was honored, for his son Antigonus, understanding that his remains were coming over from Syria, went with all his fleet to the islands to meet them. They were there presented to him in a golden urn, which he placed in his largest admiral galley. All the cities where they touched in their passage sent chaplets to adorn the urn, and deputed certain of their citizens to follow in mourning, to assist at the funeral solemnity. When the fleet approached the harbor of Corinth, the urn, covered with purple and a royal diadem upon it, was visible upon the poop, that part of the ship, and a troop of young men attended in arms to receive it at landing. Xenophantus, the most famous musician of the day, played on the flute the most solemn measure, to which the rowers, as the ship came in, made loud response, their oars, like the funeral beating of the breast, keeping time with the cadence of the music. Now, you don't have to injure yourself to do that, and you kind of learn that, kind of like you can learn to take a punch and not get hurt as much. But Antigonus, in tears and mourning attire, excited among the spectators gathered on the shore the greatest sorrow and compassion, after crowns and other honors had been offered at Corinth, the remains were conveyed to Demetrius, a city to which Demetrius had given its name, peopled from the inhabitants of small villages of Iolcus. Demetrius left no other children by his wife Phila but Antigonus and Stratonique, but he had 2 other sons, both of his own name, one surnamed the Thin by an Illyrian mother, and one who had ruled in Cyrene by Ptolemais. He had also by Didamia a son, Alexander, who lived and died in Egypt, and there are some that say he had a son by Eurydice named Corhabus. His family was continued in a succession of kings down to Perseus, the last from whom the Romans took Macedonia. And now Macedonia drama ended, let us prepare to see the Roman.